I am so excited. I'm like jumping through my skin excited to talk to Sheryl. Sheryl, by the way, as we've said before, she's the author of Closing the Loop, Systems Thinking for Designers. It's published through Rosenfeld Media, who again is a very generous sponsor today. I do want to say, as we are conversing, go ahead and put some questions in the chat. I will do my best to leave time at the end to get one or two of those questions. So go ahead and do that. And yeah, so I met Sheryl maybe like 2 or 3 months maybe before the book was published through a mutual friend. And when she told me she was writing this book, I just was like fangirling all over the place. And I think I told her this story about how, like, when I meet people, tell them what I do, I'll often say, I think of myself as a systems thinker. And a lot of times, I'll get pushback, and they'll be like, you don't know what systems thinking is. How can you say that? You don't design systems. And I don't know everything about the world. So I take a step back and I'm like, okay, well, maybe I don't know what I'm talking about. I don't know. But I have to tell you, as soon as I got this book, before we even get to the table of contents, I already have all the validation I need. I am a systems thinker, and I can say this with confidence. And when someone pushes back on me next time, I can quote them this. Systems thinking is a mindset and approach that helps you consider and analyze systems as a whole, consider the relationships within them, and investigate cause and effect that leads to specific outcomes. So this audience in particular, I would imagine that really resonates with you, especially those of you who've been through Sophia's course. We do some level of systems thinking in our work. So, but also I have to say, in reading this book, there's so much more left to learn about systems thinking. And I'm so excited about this because it's all really, really good stuff. And so with that, I'm just going to start with a basic foundational question for you, Sheryl. Can you tell us what you think the difference between design thinking and systems thinking is?
Yeah, so I get into this a little bit in the book in terms of okay, first I'll back it up a little bit. My background is as a product designer and as a design strategist and researcher. And so I feel like throughout the course of my career, I've been kind of forced to expand my lens, especially as I've become exclusively, for the most part, a design strategist, beyond just my role as a designer in kind of producing something. So I now think of my role in design as more or less facilitation of other people's expertise. And that's a big part of systems thinking for me is, and I think an important part of the practice is expanding your lens of who your stakeholders are. I think in terms of design thinking and systems thinking, I talk a lot about how there's kind of this narrow lens, specifically on user-centered design. And it's really oriented oftentimes around an end user and how the direct benefits of that end user using the product or service or what have you that you're designing. And I think there's some limitations to kind of thinking about things in that way, especially as we're kind of designing things at scale, that as we acknowledge that some of the things that we design, even if we're designing just for our end users, might have radiating effects or knock-on effects when it comes to people who are affected or harmed by the things that we design, or might be a beneficiary of something. I do a lot of work in education, for example, and that is primarily a space where your end users even your end users are not the same as like whoever's buying the product. Anyone who works in enterprise UX would recognize that as well. And so I think the way I look at systems thinking is it really is like broadening your lens to think about the different ways that things are interconnected, to think about causality more explicitly, like beyond just like what happens when somebody is using a product or service that you're designing. And then also thinking, expanding your notion of wholeness. So like where does the thing that I'm working on sit in terms of like the entirety of the system, or a broader lens on what that system is. And so I describe it as just like sort of expanding your lens. And I think these things can actually work well together, although I do think like there are some tensions in terms of like the narrowness of focus in terms of your end user, and if you're really focused on just like your end user versus kind of all the different stakeholders that you might have to think about when you take a systems thinking lens.
Yeah, again, I think your answer resonates for this audience. Those of us who practice object-oriented thinking have learned from Sophia. We work best as cross-functional teams. We want to include everybody. And so, yeah, again, if you haven't, like, just go get the book, use the discount code, go get the book. It's, you will love it. So yeah, I have like 1,000 follow-up questions from what you just said. But I'm gonna stick to my script for a minute, and I'm gonna ask you, you do sort of elaborate on what a system is and the difference between hard systems and soft systems. Can you explain that to our audience?
Yeah, I think I want to say, it's funny because like whenever I do these things, I kind of need the book like right next to me. But in terms of the distinction between hard systems and soft systems, that's a notion that stems from Peter Checkland, who did a lot of like basically the foundational writing and thinking around systems thinking methodologies. And hard systems are really like what we would think of probably primarily as like engineering problem solving. So how can you kind of like think about things in multiple parts and then kind of solve for that? Like, building an airplane, for example, is hard system, is like that's like a hard system. Like you are kind of thinking about things and components and then how they fit together and then how they form systems. Soft systems thinking methodology is really oriented around complexity and understanding complexity. Like it's more of a nebulous kind of like ambiguous space. I think a good metaphor for this is Karl Popper, the philosopher, had this notion of like cloud problems and clock problems. And I think of like hard systems as clock problems, like you're figuring out how to build something, you're figuring out how to create a clock, right? And the clock needs to work a certain way. And how you make that happen, how you problem solve in that way is getting the clock to do what you want it to do. And cloud problems are more ambiguous, they're multi-directional. There's this notion that I like in systems thinking called multi-finality, which is like there are different potential outcomes or potential solutions or interventions to a problem space. And I think that's where I live in terms of systems thinking, because I'm working like with a strategic lens towards creating more definition and clarity, and like in these kind of like very broad, almost like ambiguous spaces. And what that means is that it's really like inquiry based. So you are kind of engaging with different stakeholders and essentially kind of like arriving at possibilities for navigating a problem space. I know I said the word solution, but I try to avoid that because it's like solution has some notion of finality in it. And if you're engaging in systems thinking, you realize that solutions are actually the cause of like many problems. And that's actually like a principle from Peter Seng's book, The Fifth Discipline, which is like also foundational text and systems thinking. He says something, I'm paraphrasing, he says something along the lines of like, today's problems are yesterday's solutions. And so I think about your method of problem solving within systems thinking as like navigating a problem space and coming up with interventions or initiatives or kind of ways of, essentially ways of intervening and navigating. And so, another thing that, I kind of note in the book is like language matters, like how we describe things matter. And so kind of like shifting some of that actually helps make the case for like this mode of thinking.
Yeah. I have been like annoyingly repeating the let's step away from solutions and think about more approach, because today's solutions are tomorrow's problems. I've said this like at least 10 times in the last week. So I appreciate that. Okay. I want to be mindful of the amount of time that we have. So I'm like, should I ask this question or should I just go to this question? I think I'm just going to go to this question. So, but before I go to that question, I also want to say, I think like, again, just for our audience, the way that I'm sort of reading Sheryl's book and the processes and the thinking, it's like up here. It's like the strategy, it's the thinking, it's the research, it's the how do we do the thing. And then we can use OOUX as like to piece all that stuff out. So that's how I kind of see these two concepts, these two approaches really playing with each other, the relationship between the two, which is a good segue into the next question that I have. So I know that this is something that's really top of Sophia's mind as well. So as OOUXers, what we map relationships using something called a nested object matrix. So what we do is we put all of our objects into a matrix and we ask for each thing, like, do these two things have a relationship? What is that relationship? Do they have more than one relationship? What is it? And so for each object, we have nested objects that have relationships with our host object, basically. So like a main object and then things that have relationships with it. So my question to you is, can you walk us through how you think about or map relationships in systems thinking, and like what kinds of questions are you asking along the way?
Yeah, I mean, I taught, it's kind of funny because like, I think if you read this book and you've like worked anywhere near the design practice, there's probably quite a few frameworks where you're like, I'm already doing this stuff. For example, I get pretty in depth about like how you might conduct research in order to do like a systems thinking oriented project. And again, this stems from that idea from soft systems methodology that this is like an inquiry-based process, right? And so a big part of that, like I have an entire chapter on stakeholder mapping, because I think there's a couple of reasons why you might want to start with that if you're doing systems thinking. And the other frameworks obviously are things like causal loop mapping, which is a form of systems mapping that a lot of people, causal loop diagrams, I think CLDs, it's like a method that people really associate with systems thinking, but I think there are all these other things that you can integrate in order to enact this systems thinking mindset that are maybe even more, accessible and approachable than creating like huge causal loop diagrams. And stakeholder mapping is one of them, because I think there is this nice like focus within the design practice that is oriented around empathy, around understanding people. And I actually think about it as like kind of a design superpower. And so starting with people and who they are and where they sit in relation to each other is a really good way to kind of orient around systems thinking. So I have like some basic things like Bronfenbrenner's ecological framework is a good starting point. That's basically just nesting concentric circles like within each other and like displaying the relationships. Like all of these things have like really like, I don't know, kind of powerful academic labels, but then I'm just like, it's just like putting circles into another circle and then like talking about who is at the center of things and how do they have relationships with like secondary and tertiary stakeholders. And I think that's really helpful. Again, like I use these kinds of mapping sort of methods all the time in my work in education, because it is just like, that is like a very like, I don't know, I think, you know, I don't know how many people are familiar with the term wicked problems, but it's a term that was coined by Horst Ritter in the 70s to kind of describe problems that are particularly complex and there's like no singular solution for them. And so anything that I'm working on in the space of education falls into that category where like there's never going to be like a magic bullet for any of the problem spaces that I'm thinking about. And so what that means is there's going to be multiple layers of stakeholders. And I think a thing to like truly acknowledge here, this is kind of an aside, is that as you're kind of engaging in this work, you're never going off as a designer and doing it on your own. It requires a lot of alignment and a lot of facilitation in terms of like bringing in just like cross-disciplinary, multidisciplinary perspectives and making sure that you're broadening your lens of who stakeholders are. It's not just like whoever the decision maker is on your project and yourself and end user, right? It's like, you know, I can kind of talk like in the realm of education, it's like all these different players within the education system. It's policymakers as well. And then also just like thinking about, I don't know, like the students, teachers, administrators, policymakers, and also academics who have researchers who have expertise in this space who might already have like sort of a systems oriented lens into the problem space. Because I don't know, like I'm not a domain expert necessarily. And so like I need to rely on other people's knowledge and expertise in order to fill out my understanding of the system. You know, which leads to kind of like the other designer superpower that I think about in this space. And that is like skills in visual mapping. So a lot of like the techniques that I refer to are visual mapping tools that can sort of like express systems in a way that other people can understand and align on. And so that is kind of like integrating your already skilled approach to like taking an empathic lens towards a problem space and towards the people involved, and then having the skill to engage in like these forms of visual mapping that tell the story of what a system is, where the problems are, and where you can potentially intervene.
Awesome. I want you to just like, I want you to just record this book so I can just listen to it over and over and over again. But about along the lines what you were saying about visual mapping, I think if anyone is wants to kind of up that skill, I haven't gotten this book myself yet, but it's on my list. But Stuck by Abby Covert, it's new, and she's really talking about diagramming. So I think that would be a really good resource for all of us. Sophia, did you have any follow-up questions to what Sheryl just talked about?
I
mean, I would love like the idea. I mean, you say it somewhere in the book that like relationships are just, it's so important figuring out what are the things and how do they relate to each other. And with OOUX, or the things we're thinking about the concepts within one system. And it's like taking it that level up and thinking about the things as systems themselves or groups of stakeholders, which is really interesting. And so like, I'm looking at this map, it's the home-based medicine program map. Remember that one? And like, there's so many interesting kind of nodes here, like with caretakers, adult children versus spouses. We kind of have these groups of potential stakeholders. So caretakers versus communities, communities being religious leaders versus faith-based institutions. A community could also be something like, actually, where's the color coding here? Services, like a library service versus a city council member being part of one of those services. So there's so many things in this map, but how do you start, like, or do you in this, is it too much to go in and start saying, well, what are the relationships? If I'm just thinking about caretakers, what are the relationships if I'm a caretaker for somebody that needs stay-at-home medical care? What is often the relationship between a spouse and the adult children? So the relationships there, or just for example, faith-based institutions and libraries, like just exploring all those potential relationships. Do you have any tools for that? Or do you ever go down those kind of rabbit holes, if you will, of mapping the relationships between these individual components, if you will?
Yeah, I mean, I think with that particular case study, and then just like also kind of thinking about your mapping exercises in general, is like, you have to be really clear about like, what is the purpose of this particular mapping exercise? One of the questions I often get is like, okay, so you're doing kind of like systems mapping, how do you know when to stop? And I think like part of it is that you like, because you're aiming to capture more than sits within your direct purview, you're kind of reliant on people who might be experts in different parts of the system in order to kind of like give you an inclination of like what is important to include and what doesn't necessarily matter. So you're never like creating these diagrams on your own, right? Like you're not, like, these diagrams really start in workshops. So I think that actually alleviates some of the need to be like, oh my gosh, where do I stop? Because you're always kind of like checking it against your stakeholders and their knowledge. And so the reason to potentially do a deep dive, like for example, in that case study on like who the caretakers are, is if there's something you need to understand specifically in order to identify opportunities for change, right? So like a good example is just like within that case study is that the mapping exercise to begin with was oriented around where can we create these other avenues of communication for this like really valuable program that wasn't getting enough attention, and what are the potential barriers there, as well as like what are some things that we may not have been thinking about within the system that might present an opportunity. And it might be that going deep in that space that you're referring to about who the caretakers are might reveal certain opportunities that you didn't think about before. Or it might just be, oh, we just need to understand who is involved there, where they're coming from, etc. So that kind of like creates sort of a natural stopping point, is like kind of always going back to like, why are we even mapping this to begin with, so that we're not like just spinning out forever. And that team actually dove really deep in like some other specific area where they found opportunities. And yeah, you kind of like see this all the time, like where, I don't know, like a good example, just like in the wild, is like the distribution of vaccines, for example, where like vaccines need to be refrigerated. And there were certain vaccines, I think the Gates Foundation like funded an initiative in this space where they partnered with like Coca-Cola delivery to get vaccines to places that didn't have a great deal of refrigeration, that were in really like rural places, in countries, you know, in like low resource economies. And yeah, one thing we know is, if you've ever been to the sticks in like, you know, like where my family's from, like in the Philippines, like there's not a lot, there's not a lot of refrigeration there, but you know what gets there? The Coca-Cola truck. So it's like, how do you like identify opportunities like that and like take advantage of those kinds of ways that the system already works, in that case, from like a logistics standpoint, to be able to like actually use systems thinking as a point of innovation.
Awesome.
That's really good advice for me as I'm starting my new job and I'm learning about this thing and that thing and this thing and that thing. And I want to deep dive into all of those things. I need to like take a step back and like prioritize what are the things that I actually do need to deep dive into and can save for later. Okay, so I'm gonna throw it to the audience in a second. Sophia, if you, or Imogen, if you've been monitoring the chat, pick a good question that we can toss to Sheryl. But I'll finish my section with this. I was gonna ask, like, you know, in the book, you talk a lot about systems for social change. You talk a lot about wicked issues, wicked problems, which is so dreamy. And I wish we could all work on those kinds of things. But a lot of us live and work in the corporate world. We work in service of capitalism. We work on enterprise problems. And my question to you was going to be, is it still worth bringing that kind of thinking, systems thinking into that work? And I think we have learned, yes, it is totally still worth bringing that kind of thinking into that work. So I really appreciate the time that you've given us, and I'll throw it over to Sophia. Imogen, is there a question that we can throw to Sheryl?
There are so many good questions. We've been pasting them over into this Google Doc. So Imogen, I'll let you pick one first.
Okay, well, I'm just gonna start at the top because it's a really good question, but I might just add a little bit.
That might be a question more for me or like other OOUXers.
Well,
right?
I was gonna add, yeah, maybe you could kind of answer it, but I think so. The question is verbatim, but I'll add on to it. So the question is, coming from the world of object-oriented UX, what is the difference between systems thinking and object-oriented UX in practice? To add on to this, I would say, like, again, what is the relationship here in thinking about kind of an end-to-end experience and a service? We talk a lot in the UK of service design and service language. Is there a relationship there? Is there a synergy? I assume yes, but I'd love to hear your thoughts on that. Maybe Sophia on the relationship between OOUX specifically.
Yeah, so I think I can like, I don't know a lot about object-oriented UX, but I do feel like it's sort of like a method that like it feels kind of like you can funnel systems thinking insights or findings into OOUX, very much the way you would funnel, like, you know, design research fundings or findings or insights. And I think, like, this is also related to what Upma was just talking about in terms of, you know, some of us are working in big enterprise. We're not necessarily working on what we would call wicked problems. And I think I get this question a lot, like, where is this useful for me? Like, I'm not working in sort of like the social impact space that you work in, Sheryl. So like, you know, where can I actually use this? And I think one major way is like considering like your own organization and their decision making. It's not a mistake that systems thinking and organizational change management have intersected for decades at this point, because I think there's a lot of value in kind of thinking about things like root cause and causality, just in terms of the decision making within your own organization. And so if you're not feeling like, oh, I can use these methods to examine a system that's oriented around huge social change, like I'm not working on vaccines or what have you, then I think you can at the very least like integrate it in terms of like, how are decisions being made in your organization? What kinds of communications do you engage in? And how can you analyze how that has an impact on the products and services that you're potentially working on? So I think that sort of addresses this idea that many designers have for me, which is just like, none of this is in my lane. Like my lane is like designing screens, like I'm a digital designer. I'm just like working on a product. A lot of like the things you're talking about, the decisions are made way before I'm even involved. And my perspective on that is like, yeah, but you can help, you can use your design skills to help further the strategic conversation that exists surrounding the product that you're working on. And you can kind of use these methods to try to make decisions, let's say like on features or whatever within your product. Like some of our systems thinking exercises, like we design in my practice, like complex things like digital courseware, for example. And I think there's a certain directionality to that where you're kind of designing this course, like we recently worked on like a chemistry course for higher ed, but there are these, by engaging in some of the systems thinking exercise of like stakeholder mapping and kind of understanding where people sit, we're actually able to kind of define features that would sit within the product that address things like communication between different stakeholder users of the product. And I think there's a utility in that can manifest directly in whatever you are problem solving for within the products that you're working on, as well as, maybe informing on that meta level, just how decisions happen within your organization. So I personally would love to hear about like creative ways that people are thinking about using some of these methods. And yeah, I think that there's a relationship there in terms of like how you can funnel other problem solving from systems thinking exercises.
So yeah, I think that there's just so many different ways that these two worlds could come together. And I think like there's the how can system design start influencing what we do in object-oriented UX. And I think that, and overall, actually what I want to say is, and we are actually trying to have a hard stop at 1, but
Yeah, I gotta drop.
But overall, I think what systems design, the amazing tools that Sheryl gives you in her book and the tools that we use in OOUX both do the same thing of trying to push boundaries. And a lot of times our job as UX designers is not just to design screens. Our job is often, it's not in our job description, but to be a thorn in the side of some other structures and to ask better questions, ask bigger questions. If we've been given this scope, our job is to push the boundaries of that scope, to break down silos, to say, well, what I'm doing over here, it's connected to what I'm doing over here. OOUX helps you do that. And everything that Sheryl is telling, like even helps you do that at this like grander, broader scheme of helping us ask better questions so we can push those boundaries. Because that is so much of our job, is to say, no, we cannot be thinking myopically like this. Because so much of what we're asked to do in this industry, the reason our industry is, in my thoughts, kind of broken, is that we think in silos, we think myopically, and we are given these little features, or you just redesign this part of this page without thinking about everything, without thinking about the other pages, much less the other systems. So we can use these tools to push the box, right? And ask better questions, ask uncomfortable questions. And just thinking about how, like, for the OOUXers here, thinking about how system design, we can start threading in some of these methods that Sheryl talks about. It's like asking why, like, wait, why do we need this object? What, like, if we bring this object or this attribute or this call to action, like, we can do it for all parts of the Orca process. And we can say, okay, there's reasons to put it in, but are there also reasons to not put it in? We do that a little bit with our calls to action, but even an attribute level, like number of likes. Like, do we really need to put number of, like, what can be the other consequences of having number of likes or a popularity algorithm or things like that? What are the other unintended consequences? And then also how OOUX can aid systems design thinking. And I honestly think the entire Orca process, we can take it a level up. And instead of thinking about objects, think about systems. Do a nested systems matrix where you think about systems to systems and you map all the system relationships. That could be really interesting. In our call to action matrix, extend the number of stakeholder groups. We usually just think about roles in a call to action matrix, the roles within our given system, which usually expands more than what we were thinking before, because we're thinking about admin roles and customer service roles. But if you go even further and start saying, what are the other stakeholders? And I love, Sheryl, I love your broader view and your broader definition of stakeholder. Like, stakeholders can be way outside of your system. They can be levels outside of your system. And for us to think much more broadly about that, it's really exciting. Can't tell I'm excited about it.
Well said. Well said.
Well, I think
Do we have time for one more question?
Well, I need to drop to go to a meeting. So if you all want us to hang out here, feel free.
Sheryl, it's up to you. We got about 5 or 6 questions, so maybe we can do like 1 or 2 more questions, but if you have a hard stop, then I can send you the questions and we can decide what to do with them later.
Yeah, I can stay for like another 2 minutes, but I also have a meeting. So
okay. I'm gonna steal 2 minutes from you.
Yeah.
And this question is tough, but this is from Dan. How do you prevent systems thinking from paralyzing the design process, considering all the moving parts can make it difficult to make small changes? This is kind of along the theme that we've been talking about.
Yeah, that's a really, that's truly a practical concern. And I get asked that a lot. It's like, I don't have time to do like a causal loop diagram that's going to take a month when whatever I was working on is supposed to have been done yesterday. I think it's maybe like finding some outlets for this as you're doing, like, I don't know if people like still do like discovery processes, like, you know, when they're kind of designing things, but like squeezing some of this analysis into your discovery process. Like, it's really easy to do an iceberg diagram, like during a discovery workshop, for example, and engaging like different stakeholders. I think that's one of the things that I was focused on, was like just some tools that are really kind of directly applicable and maybe that you could do tomorrow. Like, you could do a fishbone diagram tomorrow, right? Like with your team, to kind of like understand the root causes of things. So I think there are practical ways you can engage in it, and maybe like as you display proof of its value, you can you know, theoretically gain more time to be able to engage in these things earlier and earlier. And I think it's like anything else that you engage in the design process. If it feels like there's some sort of value that it provides, or I mean, I don't want to put it directly in the terms of like return on investment, but you know, like you're investing time and energy into doing this thing, and if it leads to like a greater understanding, especially with your decision-making stakeholders, and it also leads to potential innovation, I mean, those are the kinds of things that likely resonate with leadership, like within your organization.
Yeah. And I think that like my answer when people ask me that similar question of like, wait, we don't have time to do all this, my answer is very similar to this. I'm like, you don't have time not to do this. Like, the consequences of not doing it could take so much more time. Like the introducing of the invasive species example is great. Like, you think that you're solving this problem, and then you've created so much more work for yourself because you didn't do the systems thinking up front. And you basically have painted yourself into a corner that's going to be really time and money intensive to get out of. And it's also scalable. It's scalable. Do a little bit, show the value, and then, get your foot in the door, do some more of it. Imogen, so y'all need to go to your meetings. If you have meetings, if you had a meeting at the hour, you're already late to it. So feel free to drop off. And Imogen, do we need to are we going to email people who won the book?
Yeah, I'll figure that out in the next hour.
Awesome. All right. Thank you all so much. Happy OOUXing, happy systems designing, and see you next time.
Bye, everybody. Thank you.